Good evening, and thank you for inviting me to talk to you about reservoirs. I'm Tony Deakin, and I'm the Flood and Coastal Risk Manager in the Environment Agency, responsible for regulating the Reservoirs Act in England. I do this by leading 4 teams consisting of the enforcement team, the compliance and monitoring team, the data team, and the standards and incidents team. The photo in this slide is of Toddbrook during the incident. My talk tonight will focus on the changes expected over the next 5 years. This presentation is split into 3 parts. First part being an introduction to English reservoirs and incidents in general. Part 2 covers the Toddbrook incident, and Part 3 looks at the longer term implications and what this means to owners, engineers and the regulator. Part A. Our role. As the regulator, we are responsible for maintaining a register of reservoirs that fall under the Reservoirs Act, providing a risk designation for every registered reservoir, i.e. high risk or not high risk, working with owners and engineers to help secure compliance. We do this through monitoring, i.e. talking to people, enforcement, and if both of these fail, we can use our emergency powers to step in and take control and make sure the reservoir is safe. Using these powers will also incur costs that can be recovered from the owner. We also provide a flood map for every registered reservoir, which also helps us to provide a risk designation, helps local authorities with future local planning needs, and also emergency services during incidents. We also produce a biannual report and an annual report, but I'll talk about these later. As the owner, you will be responsible for registering your reservoir with us, managing any risk associated with the reservoir, appointing the relevant engineers, i.e. a supervising engineer at all times, an inspecting engineer to carry out a Section 10 report every 10 years. A Section 10 report is similar to a car MOT. And finally, from the Section 10 report, if there are any safety works, you'll need to appoint a qualified civil engineer to oversee these works are done to a safe and proper standard. You'll also need to create an on-site emergency plan, which will help you during an incident and help stop any incident getting worse. And finally, you'll also need to report any incident to us. I just wanted to share this slide to show you what we do with the information that you provide to us on any incident. I also just wanted to let you know that it is not an offence under the Reservoirs Act to have an incident at a reservoir, but it is an offence not to report one. We use the information provided to create our annual incident report, which is mainly produced to share lessons learned or to help identify any research and development needs where there are gaps in our learning. You will all see from the pie chart in the bottom right hand corner that incidents tend to be either internal erosion, which can happen over a long period of time, or overtopping, which tends to be fairly fast reacting due to heavy rainfall or a flooding event. Right, moving on to part 2. I'm sure most of you will have heard about the incident at Toddbrook, which happened in 2019. Following the incident, government ministers asked for 2 investigations to take place. The first one was to review the incident and to learn any lessons from it. The second was to review the legislation. We appointed Professor David Barnforth to carry out the incident review. At the same time, the owner, Canal and Rivers Trust, also decided to appoint their own engineer to investigate the incident too. Both reports concluded that poor design was the main factor in causing the incident. Both also said that water passing under the concrete spillways eroded the foundations, but differed on how the water got there. Barnforth stated that the water passed through the concrete slab joints. Dr. Hughes stated that the water passed under the slab due to internal erosion, which happened over a longer period of time. Both agreed that maintenance issues also added to the factor of the failure. But as you can see from the picture, the vegetation growing through the joints may have led to some of the joint leaks as well. The initial incident review showed that a compliant reservoir may not be a safe reservoir, as before the incident Toddbrook was fully compliant. This led to the review of the legislation, which the government recently accepted all the recommendations, and now we are just starting to plan how we will implement them. So what are the changes that are expected over the next few years? As you can see from the slide, there are quite a number of changes that need to happen. And tonight I'm just going to talk through a few of the main items that may affect you. The first one being the volume. Ministers want us to consider lowering the volume from 25,000 cubic metres down to 10,000 cubic metres, but they also initially want us only to look at introducing a voluntary registration scheme. Secondly, giving us new powers as the regulator. These new powers may include civil sanctions, which will allow us to enter a site, and if we see any inappropriate work, we can stop it there and then. Over the next 2 years, we'll also be investigating whether to introduce a charging scheme where we can recover our costs from the owners, similar to what happens in Scotland and Wales. We're also going to be given new powers to act as an arbitrator between an owner and an engineer in case neither of those can agree what safety works need doing. And finally, we'll also be given powers to investigate and review engineers' work, mainly to look at the standards, but also to look at how we can help engineers and owners communicate with each other. Because I'm sure you'll be aware some of the reports that some of the engineers produce are quite technical and very difficult to understand. Other things that we're considering introducing and changing are reviewing the current risk designation and trying to introduce a more risk-based approach. As I'm sure you'll be aware, the current system is quite simplistic, i.e. it's either high risk or not high risk. So we're considering looking at splitting the high risk into 3 subcategories, which will help manage risk and make it a fairer way to inspect and investigate. Other things we're looking at are the supply of engineers. As I've mentioned earlier, the reduction in the volume will introduce more reservoirs to be regulated, so we need to make sure we've got enough engineers in place over the future to be able to provide a service to you as owners. We'll also be looking at incident reporting that we do. As I've mentioned earlier, incidents are reported on an annual basis, but one of the things we want to do is make sure we can share any lessons we learn as soon as possible rather than wait for a year to do that. And then finally, with all these changes, we will need to provide you with new guidance documents to help you understand what the changes are and have information available that you can go back to at any time you need. I want to thank you once again for inviting me to talk to you this evening. I've included on this slide a number of links to more detailed information about what I've spoken about. I've also included my email address if anyone wants to contact me directly. Now, are there any questions?